You're listening to the Archetype Effect, conversations redefining power, purpose and leadership for women and the coaches who guide them. I'm Ros Cardinal, leadership coach and creator of the Women's Leader Archetypes. Together we'll explore the real stories, the research and reflections that help women rise with clarity and authentic power. There's something I've been noticing for a long time now. It shows up in coaching rooms, in leadership conversations, in well-meaning development work that's meant to support growth. And it's subtle enough that we rarely name it. Most coaching, even good coaching, is built on an assumption that something needs to improve, that the client has to move somewhere else, become more confident, more decisive, more boundaried, less reactive, less afraid. And again, I want to be careful here, because the people doing this work are usually thoughtful. They care deeply. They want to help. But underneath the questions, the reflections, the tools, there's often an unspoken pressure, a sense that the current way of being is provisional, that who you are right now is not quite enough yet, that growth is a kind of correction. What I've seen, especially with women, is how quickly that pressure gets absorbed by the nervous system. Even when the coach is kind, even when the intention is supportive, even when the conversation is insightful. Something tightens. The client starts performing insight, performing self-awareness, performing change. They talk about their patterns, but with judgment. They describe their behaviours, but as problems to be solved. They start monitoring themselves in the room. Am I being reflective enough? Am I progressing fast enough? Am I doing coaching right? And very quietly, coaching becomes another place where power feels conditional. Not because the coach intends it that way, but because improvement itself carries an implied hierarchy, where safety depends on improvement. I want to name something gently here. This doesn't happen because coaches are doing something wrong. It happens because fixing is the dominant language of development. We've been taught, explicitly or implicitly, that growth means moving away from who you are now. That awareness is only valuable if it leads to change. That insight has to be operationalised. That staying with recognition alone is indulgent or incomplete. So even in reflective spaces, the body stays alert. Because if I'm here to be improved, then I'm not quite safe yet. What archetypal work disrupts, quietly but profoundly, is this assumption. Because archetypes don't ask you to become someone else. They ask you to see what's already been happening. They don't frame behaviour as good or bad. They don't position patterns as mistakes. They don't create a hierarchy of evolved versus unevolved selves. They say something much more destabilising and much more relieving. This makes sense, not this needs fixing, but this has intelligence. And that single shift changes the entire coaching relationship, because the moment behaviour is understood as adaptive rather than deficient, the nervous system relaxes. Not completely, not permanently, but enough. Enough to stop performing, enough to stop defending, enough to stop proving readiness for change. Recognition replaces evaluation, and when that happens, something important becomes possible. Not action yet, not strategy, not solutions, but presence. This episode isn't about how to coach with archetypes. It's about what changes when archetypes enter the room at all. Because before tools, before technique, before application, something else happens first. The atmosphere shifts. And once you've felt that shift, it's very hard to go back. There's a moment that happens sometimes in coaching. It's quiet. Easy to miss if you're not looking for it. Nothing dramatic shifts on the surface, no breakthrough language, no sudden insight. But something in the room softens. The client stops explaining themselves quite so much. Their shoulders drop a fraction. Their voice steadies. They're no longer trying to land the right answer. They're just there. This is the moment recognition does its real work. Not recognition as praise, not recognition as affirmation, but recognition as orientation. When a pattern is named without judgment, the nervous system receives a very specific message. I'm not wrong for this. I don't have to defend this. I don't have to fix this yet. And that message changes everything, because most people don't arrive in coaching unaware. They already know they overfunction. They already know they withdraw. They already know they control, hesitate, please, or disappear. What they don't know is why those patterns show up when they do. So they come in braced. They narrate their behaviour like a confession. They catalogue their shortcomings carefully. They speak about themselves as a problem to be solved. Recognition interrupts that posture. When you say, implicitly or explicitly, this makes sense given what you're protecting, the body stops arguing. Not because the behaviour is endorsed, but because it's no longer pathologised. This is where archetypes do something subtle and powerful. They relocate the conversation away from personality and into pattern, away from identity and into context. Suddenly, the question isn't, what's wrong with me? It becomes, what's happening here? And that shift changes who holds power in the room. Because when behaviour is framed as adaptive, the client doesn't need to justify themselves. They don't need to convince the coach they're trying hard enough. They don't need to prove readiness for change. They can actually feel what's been happening. And feeling precedes choice. This is why recognition is not a passive intervention. It's not neutral. It's not inert. It actively dismantles shame. And shame is the thing that keeps patterns sticky. Not lack of insight, not lack of motivation. Shame. When shame is present, people change strategically. They change to be acceptable, to be approved, to be seen as progressing. When shame softens, something else emerges. Curiosity. And curiosity is the first signal of real agency returning. I've watched this happen countless times. A woman who's been describing her withdrawal suddenly pauses and says, "Oh, I thought I was failing, but this is me protecting my authority." A leader who's been criticising her control notices, "I only get like this when I feel solely responsible." A coach who's been over-giving realises, "I don't actually feel safe to disappoint anyone." Nothing has been solved yet. No action plan, no new behaviour, but the internal stance has changed. They're no longer standing against themselves. And once that happens, the coaching relationship changes too, because the coach is no longer positioned as the one who sees more clearly. You're not the translator of their inner world. You're not the arbiter of insight. You're a witness to a pattern that already exists. And that does something important to power. It levels it. The client doesn't feel managed, they feel met. They don't feel corrected, they feel understood. And from that place, something unexpected happens. The urgency to change drops away. Not because change isn't desired, but because it no longer feels compulsory. They're not changing to be acceptable. They're changing because they have more room. This is the paradox that often surprises coaches. When you stop pushing for change, it becomes more possible. Because the nervous system is no longer using all its energy to stay defended. Recognition doesn't create movement directly, it creates space. And space is where choice lives. That's why in archetypal work, recognition itself is an intervention, not a prelude, not a warm-up, but the thing that allows anything else to happen without force. And once you've worked this way, once you felt that shift in the room, it becomes very hard to return to coaching that relies on pressure, improvement, or urgency. Because you've seen what happens when people are allowed to stand where they actually are. Not as a starting point to be tolerated, but as a position that already contains intelligence. One of the least examined aspects of coaching is power. We talk about partnership, we talk about equality, we talk about holding space, but power is still there. It always is. Someone is facilitating, someone is guiding the frame, someone is asking the questions. And when growth is framed as improvement, power tends to sit quietly with the coach. Not overtly, not abusively, but structurally. The coach becomes the one who sees patterns more clearly, the one who knows what progress looks like, the one who can sense when the client is there or not. Even when the relationship is warm, the hierarchy remains. And most clients feel it. They adjust to it. They perform competence inside it. They shape their stories so they sound reflective, self-aware, coachable. Again, not because anyone's doing something wrong, but because power, when unspoken, still exerts pressure. What archetypal work does, without announcing it, is redistribute that power. Because the moment a pattern is named as adaptive, the coach is no longer positioned as the one who knows better. You're not correcting a blind spot. You're not guiding someone towards a better version of themselves. You're orienting together. And orientation is shared. The coach is no longer ahead of the client on some invisible development ladder. You're both looking at the same terrain. That changes responsibility. In traditional improvement-based coaching, responsibility subtly shifts upwards. The coach feels responsible for insight landing, progress occurring, movement becoming visible. If the client stays stuck, the coach wonders what they missed. If change is slow, the coach adjusts technique. If momentum drops, the coach feels pressure to intervene. Archetypal recognition loosens that, because when behaviour is understood as protective rather than resistant, stuckness stops being a problem to solve. It becomes information, and information doesn't require rescuing. This is one of the quiet reliefs coaches often don't expect. They stop carrying the client's change for them. They don't need to manufacture momentum. They don't need to outthink the pattern. They don't need to stay one step ahead. The coach can stay present without being over-responsible. And that matters because coaching relationships are one of the most common places coaches enact their own shadow. Not consciously, but subtly. The urge to help, the desire to be useful, the pressure to deliver value. When clients are framed as needing improvement, those urges get activated. The coach steps forward, takes responsibility, tries to hold the process together. But when recognition is the foundation, those dynamics soften. The coach doesn't need to save the client from their pattern because the pattern is no longer framed as a failure. It's framed as an intelligent response that can be related to rather than overridden. This creates a very different kind of safety. The client doesn't feel monitored. The coach doesn't feel burdened. Neither person has to perform. And something else shifts too. Authority becomes quieter. The coach still holds the frame, still asks questions, still reflects and names what's happening. But authority no longer comes from knowing where the client should go. It comes from being able to stay with what is without flinching. That's a very different kind of leadership. And clients feel it immediately. They stop checking whether their answers are acceptable. They stop rushing towards conclusions. They stop narrating their growth like it's a report. They start speaking more slowly, more honestly, with less self-editing, because they're no longer trying to meet an invisible standard. They're orienting themselves in real time. This is also where dependency quietly dissolves. When coaching is improvement-driven, clients can unconsciously look to the coach for validation. Am I doing this right? Is this enough? Am I progressing? Archetypal work removes that dynamic, not by pushing autonomy, but by making it unnecessary. The client doesn't need permission to stand where they are. They already do. And the coach doesn't need answers to preserve authority, because authority isn't coming from answers anymore. It's coming from presence. This is the part many coaches don't anticipate. Working this way doesn't diminish your role. It steadies it. You're no longer carrying the client forward. You're walking alongside them, facing the same terrain, with different perspective, not higher status. And that changes the emotional load of the work. The sessions feel less effortful, less urgent, less tight. There's more silence, more space, more trust in timing. Not because you're doing less, but because you're no longer compensating for a power imbalance that was never explicitly named. Recognition rebalances power without confrontation. And once that happens, the coaching relationship becomes something else entirely. Not a place for improvement, but a place of orientation. One of the easiest ways to understand the impact of archetypal work in coaching is not by looking at what gets added, but by noticing what quietly falls away. Because when recognition replaces fixing, a number of familiar dynamics simply stop being necessary. They're not corrected, they're not managed, they dissolve. The first thing that drops away is urgency. When coaching is organised around improvement, there's often an unspoken clock ticking in the room. How long will this take? When will this shift? Why is this still showing up? Even if no one says it out loud, the body feels it. Urgency keeps sessions moving, but it also keeps the nervous system alert. Once patterns are understood as adaptive, urgency loses its grip. There's no race to be different, no pressure to resolve something prematurely. The client can stay with what's actually happening rather than rushing towards what they think should be happening. And when urgency leaves, something else goes with it. Self-justification. Clients stop explaining themselves so much. They don't need to convince the coach that their behaviour is reasonable. They don't need to defend their choices. They don't need to soften, minimise, or over-contextualise. They can simply describe what's happening. And that description becomes cleaner, more precise, less emotionally charged, because they're no longer talking about themselves. They're talking from themselves. Another thing that fades is over-analysis. When behaviour is moralised, people think harder. They loop, they dissect, they try to understand themselves into change. But understanding without safety just creates more internal monitoring. Recognition does the opposite. It gives the mind permission to stop circling. Clients still reflect, but the reflection is grounded. They're not trying to solve themselves. They're orienting. Which brings us to something many coaches notice with surprise. Resistance stops being a problem. In improvement-based coaching, resistance is often treated as an obstacle, something to work through, something to gently challenge, something to reframe. In archetypal work, resistance doesn't need to be confronted because resistance is no longer interpreted as avoidance. It's recognised as protection. And once it's understood that way, it doesn't need to hold the line so tightly. People don't resist being pushed when no one's pushing them. Another subtle shift happens around advice. Clients stop fishing for it, not because they don't want direction, but because they're no longer disoriented. When someone understands why they're responding the way they are, the need for external instruction diminishes. They don't need to be told what to do next. They need space to feel their own orientation return. This also changes how action emerges. Instead of big decisions or sweeping changes, action becomes smaller, more proportionate, more contextual. Clients might notice themselves doing something slightly differently without planning to, speaking up once, pausing before stepping in, letting something sit. These changes don't feel like achievements, they feel like adjustments. And because they're not loaded with self-evaluation, they tend to stick. One last thing falls away, and this one is often felt more by the coach than the client. The need to manage the session. There's less steering, less shaping, less silent calculation about where the conversation should go. The session unfolds, not randomly and not passively, but organically. The coach can trust that what matters will surface without being engineered, because the system isn't defending itself anymore. It's listening. This doesn't make coaching vague, it makes it honest. The work slows down, but it goes deeper. The conversation becomes less busy, but more meaningful. And both people leave the room less tired, not because nothing happened, but because nothing had to be forced. When recognition is the foundation, coaching stops being a place where people try to become better versions of themselves. It becomes a place where they can finally stop bracing and start choosing. There's a temptation at this point to ask for the method, to wonder how to do this, to look for the steps, to translate what you've been hearing into something you can apply. That impulse makes sense. We're used to turning insight into action as quickly as possible. We've been trained to operationalise understanding, to convert recognition into movement. But archetypal work doesn't start there. Not because it resists application, but because it changes the order of things. Before technique, there's position. Before strategy, there's orientation. Before action, there's authorship. Archetypes don't tell you what to do in a coaching session. They change how you stand in the session. They don't offer interventions, they offer perspective. And perspective is what determines everything else. Once you've seen behaviour as adaptive rather than defective, you can't unknow it. Once you've felt what happens when shame softens in the room, you can't recreate urgency without noticing it. Once you've experienced coaching without the pressure to improve, it becomes very hard to justify pushing someone towards change before they're ready. That's why this isn't a technique you layer onto existing practice. It's a threshold you cross. On one side, coaching is about helping people become better. On the other, coaching is about helping people relate differently to their own power. These are not the same thing. And crossing that threshold doesn't make you more skilled overnight. It makes you more available. Available to stay present when nothing is moving yet. Available to resist filling the silence. Available to trust timing instead of managing it. It also asks something of the coach. You have to let go of being the one who knows what progress should look like. You have to tolerate not resolving things, not naming next steps, not tying the session up neatly, because archetypal work respects something most approaches rush past, that power doesn't respond well to force. It returns when it feels safe. This is why archetypes don't sit comfortably inside checklists or frameworks. They're not meant to be used, they're meant to be worked with. And working with them requires a different kind of confidence. Not confidence in your ability to direct, but confidence in your ability to stay, to hold a space where recognition can do its work, even when nothing looks different yet. This is where many coaches feel the quiet pull, not toward learning something new, but toward unlearning the pressure to fix, toward trusting that presence itself is active, that recognition itself is catalytic. That not intervening is sometimes the most skillful move available. And this is where we stop. Not because there's nothing more to say, but because crossing thresholds is not something you can be talked into. It's something you notice yourself standing at. If you've been listening and felt a subtle shift, a loosening of effort, a softening of urgency, a curiosity about what it would be like to coach without trying to improve anyone, that's the threshold. You don't need to step through it yet. For now, it's enough to recognise where you're standing. And maybe this is the quiet shift this season's been moving toward. Not better performance, not stronger strategies, but a different relationship with power in the room. When recognition replaces fixing, something settles. You stop trying to accelerate somebody else's becoming. You stop positioning yourself as the one who sees more clearly. You stop carrying responsibility for movement that isn't yours to manufacture. And in that space, power changes shape. It becomes less about influence over and more about steadiness within. That's the part that's easy to miss, because recognition isn't dramatic. It doesn't produce fireworks. It produces orientation. It gives someone back to themselves. And when that happens, when a woman can see her patterns without shame, without urgency, without correction, something integrates quietly. Not because she's been told what to do, but because she no longer has to defend who she is. That's what we're going to explore next. What happens after recognition, after the pattern has been named, after shame has softened, after the nervous system has stopped racing. How do you actually live with power then? Not as a concept, not as a role, not as something to manage carefully, but as something you inhabit. Next episode, we're closing this season with that conversation. Integration. Living with power after recognition. I'm Ros Cardinal. I'll see you there. Thanks for joining me on the Archetype Effect. If this episode sparked an insight, share it with a woman who leads, or leave a review so more women can find these conversations. Until next time, lead with purpose and power that feels like you.